I am on page 541, and what was happening where we left off was we had heard in granular detail how he had raised $90 million in the middle of the Depression to his West Side improvement plan with a park and a highway and everything. And to save money, he was just like, "Yep, let's just run the parkways through the middle of the parks," and that was okay. And then the last thing that happened was he ran into people, and it wasn't a money problem. It was just two people that were very passionate, and it was two Republican reformers, and one was a very dashing, handsome, witty young man about town, is actually the quote. And the other was another who wasn't described as handsome, but who knows? Maybe he was a really cunning guy in his own way. But yeah, both of them love parks in the Bronx, and so they're gonna give him a hard time. And the parks they like are way up by. I looked it up on a map later because I didn't know where Inwood Hill Park was, and it's right by the Met Cloisters. If that helped me, and I don't know if that will help you. Okay. So Exton was the really handsome one, and then the one that was also a reformer is Weinberg, who wasn't described as handsome, but might have been handsome. Exton loved that world in his park. On the top, there was a big outcropping of granite on the north end, and I used to go up there in April and just lie on it in the sun and look down at the water. I was no great outdoorsman. I'm not trying to say that. But when I went into Inwood Hill, I really felt that I had gotten away from the city, and sometimes I needed that feeling. The idea of altering that world horrified him. It was the only real woodland left on Manhattan, he recalled years later. It was the last hunk of primeval forest in the whole metropolitan area. It was unique. It was irreplaceable. And to alter it with a highway. When you were up on top there, you were away from the roar of cars and the smell of gasoline. It was the only place in Manhattan where you could still say that. Moses's proposed Henry Hudson Parkway would bring the roar and the smell right into that beautiful spot. In fact, it would, to a large extent, eradicate it, bury it under 6 lanes, 140 feet in width, of concrete, since Moses's plan was to run the highway right along the escarpment. Moses was saying that running the road through the park would destroy only a few trees. Exton knew this couldn't be true. So thick were the towering elms, maples, and oriental pines that no road 140 feet wide could be picked through them without cutting down hundreds. A highway would have values. Exton, having served on city club committees studying the traffic problem, was aware of the need for a northern outlet. But this unique, irreplaceable forest offered the city other values that a highway would destroy. And it just didn't make sense to destroy them if there was any alternate route available. Oh, it's late. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'll just fill you in, I guess. I'll give a little summary tomorrow. I think things have been picking up, but for the past 3 days, it's been a little boring. I don't know. Maybe it'll still be boring. But I think it's picking up. Also, where in the world are you? I forgot. I always forget. Jake is in somewhere in I always forget if it's it's Oxbridge. Sometimes I want to say Camford. Weinberg saw other values in Spuyten Duyvil. Okay, so Weinberg and wow, now I'm really confused. Weinberg and Exton are the two young reformers that love the parks and are mad that Moses is building a highway through them. Weinberg saw other values in Spuyten Duyvil, the residential community located atop the bluffs that faced Inwood Hill across the Harlem River. The community was not a prestige area like Fieldston, directly to the north, but it was proof that even within a large city, even families without wealth could find peacefulness, seclusion, and beauty. Its modest single-family homes, there were only 3 small apartment houses in Spuyten Duyvil then, were built on small plots. Wow, only 3 apartment houses. Okay. But they were built along ravines that led down to the Hudson and along lanes that rambled among flower gardens and picturesque rock formations and were shaded by lordly oaks and elms. A reporter who visited Spuyten Duyvil in 1935 wrote in surprise that it was a village in the midst of the city, a village straight out of some remote part of rural England. Complete to its 4 big, fieldstone and ivy-covered English country churches. It was a village that possessed a beautiful view. Many of its homes enjoyed a magnificent prospect of the Hudson and the Palisades. And an asset that was even more valuable in the city, quiet. I'm so curious who lived in these very few houses. They were probably, you would think that these were built by like the all the railroad and steel barons who like back then, the Upper West Side and Harlem and the Bronx, those would be their summer homes because that was in the country. But then when they built railroads, then it stopped being the country. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know who lived up there. I'm curious. Okay, anyway, Spuyten Duyvil, the village in the Bronx. Tucked into a corner of the Bronx as it was, it had no through traffic. The only thoroughfare wider than a country lane in all Spuyten Duyvil was Spuyten Duyvil Parkway, a 2-lane road whose right-of-way, lined by trees so big that their branches met over it umbrella fashion, was barely 30 feet. Moses's proposal to turn it into a 140-foot wide Henry Hudson Parkway by tearing down hundreds of the trees and condemning lawns of the bordering houses horrified the community. I'm still not sure how big the community is if there are 3 apartment buildings. Anyway, the road would split the community in half, making it difficult to get from one side to the other, and would funnel through it a great stream of traffic. It will be the end of beautiful Spuyten Duyvil, wailed one resident. Weinberg, whose work in city planning at Harvard and, after graduation, with the pioneering urbanologist Werner Hedgeman, had taught him the importance of human values in a city. He was interested in Spuyten Duyvil both because his family owned real estate there and because the community embodied so many human values. It's crazy that like his Harvard urban studies class was like, consider human values. That was the big lesson. He began to study Moses's plan, and his conclusions were the same as Exton's, that it made no sense if there was an alternate route available. And as the 2 young men began to study Moses's West Side Improvement Plan together, they realized immediately that there was an alternate route, the one that had been proposed before Moses, a route that, upon reaching the southern border of Inwood Hill Park, swung inland so that it would not run through the most beautiful portion of the park, but along its eastern edge and adjoining city streets, that would cross the Hudson River on a low-level bridge inland from the Hudson, whose northern terminus would not be Spuyten Duyvil, but the Marble Hill shantytown in the hollow below it. See, I don't know enough about Manhattan when you get up there and the Bronx. I didn't know that there was a, I need to say the quote, a shantytown called Marble Hill that was in a hollow. I didn't know that existed. I'm just gonna, hold on, I'm gonna like open a tab so I remember to look up Marble Hill. I'll look that up later. Yeah, it's a neighborhood. I just didn't even know. I hate, I've been here for like 3 years and I just feel like such a noob. There's so many parts of the city that I just don't even know. It was a Dutch colonial settlement in 1648. There's been people there for 400 years. I had no idea. Okay, so there is an alternate route for this highway. Also, hello. Have I gone on any power broker related outings? Okay, it's funny you should ask. I have a friend from Wikipedia editing. His name's Jim, and if you look him up on Wikipedia, his username is Jim, capital J, Jim Henderson, and I think there might be a period, and none of the rest are capitals. And he's like 75. He's been in New York City since 1973, and he remembers all the stuff that happened. And I mentioned to him, like, oh yeah, have you read The Power Broker? And he was like, oh yeah, I remember when that came out. I read a couple chapters. He said he had one friend who really didn't like one of the chapters. And so the friend was like, hey, read this chapter and see if you think it's bullshit. And so Jim read it, and it was something that he sort of knew about. And so that's why he had beef. But the book came out like 50 years ago, and yeah, Jim didn't really remember any of the details of why his friend had beef with this chapter, except that the chapter exaggerated some parts, but he couldn't remember which parts. So anyway, and it was also about building a bridge, but then I asked a lot of questions, and it's definitely not any of the bridges that we've covered so far. So that doesn't really, I'm just blabbing now, that doesn't really count as a power broker related outing, but he did talk about the power broker. Maybe I'll go. I think that my power broker related outing, if I were to do one, would be to drive the Southern State Parkway and then come back up on the Northern State Parkway and stop at all the beaches. Maybe I could spend a day doing that. Maybe I could get a little zip car. We'll see. Okay. There were, as Exton and Weinberg saw it, certain obvious advantages to this alternative. It would spare Inwood Hill and Spuyten Duyvil, eliminate the Marble Hill shantytown, and because a low-level bridge cost less than a high-level, be less expensive than Moses's plan. Condemnation costs would still be minimal because most of the right-of-way would be taken from the park edge and adjoining street beds. Only a few single-family homes would have to be condemned. Their route was only 3/4 of a mile longer, an inconsequential factor when weighed against the preservation of the city's last virgin woodland, and a uniquely peaceful residential community. I don't understand how it's cheaper, because isn't he saving millions and millions of dollars from having it in a park so that he can use PWA park funds? Maybe I just hallucinated the last 20 pages. Anyway. As Exton and Weinberg had been thinking about the alternatives, moreover, they had come to realize that their route had certain other advantages, not so obvious, but perhaps even more important. It was difficult for them to define these advantages because in the early 1930s, there was almost no literature to draw upon. It would not be for more than a decade, in fact, that terms to explain what they were thinking would come into common coinage, like ecology and environment and human scale. Moreover, the defining might well not bring them much popularity, they knew, because a nation that worshipped the engineer was not yet ready to be told that the engineer's values might not be the last word in highway design. But they struggled to define them nonetheless. I don't know, but it's what they cared about ecology, but I don't know. I feel like that was kind of what the conservation movement was doing, and everyone was a conservationist back then. Not everyone, obviously, but Teddy Roosevelt and stuff. Quote, I remember realizing that Moses was thinking in terms of the view of the river, the view that the motorist would have. He was thinking in terms of the motoring public, of automobiles, Exton says. Well, a motorist spends a few seconds at a spot and maybe he can't even look at it. Maybe he has to be looking at the car ahead of him. But the pedestrian spends a long time at a spot. He can sit down and look at it. So it's the pedestrian we should be thinking of. And then there was the damage to the park itself. Cutting down the trees would probably interfere with the natural drainage system. And then you'd have to start building drains and God knows what else. Weinberg, putting his thoughts into writing, wrote Exton that building a parkway through Spuyten Duyvil would, simply by making Spuyten Duyvil more accessible, bring many new residents and many apartment buildings to the area and to all Riverdale. Okay, so he's a NIMBY. Therefore, before the parkway was built, plans to accommodate the new residents should be made. Okay, maybe he's not a NIMBY. If apartment houses were simply plumbed down helter-skelter onto Riverdale's narrow country lanes, their residents' cars would jam them, turning Riverdale into just another extension of the noisy, traffic-jammed city. Also, just a little pause because I need to look up Riverdale because I'm really, I'm just getting images in my head of Betty and that one, Zack and Cody, that show. Okay, Riverdale is just up there. It's right by all the rest of that stuff. It's just on the west part of the Bronx. I don't know if you guys have mental maps here, but it's like, I don't know. It's up in the Bronx above the Met Cloisters, but below Yonkers. Yup, okay, that's Riverdale. Yeah, it is a TV show. I was trying to remember the characters, but I forgot. I watched the show so long ago that I'm forgetting. I remember the name of the gang was ridiculous. Riverdale gang. It was like the the South Side Serpents, which sounds so it sounds very fake because it was fake. I got really lost in thinking about Riverdale. Moses refused to do any advanced planning himself. He would not even allow Riverdale civic leaders to tell him where overpasses across the parkway should be built to be most convenient for the community, or to allow anyone else to do this, or to allow anyone else to do any. To minimize community antagonism, he kept the exact route of the parkway secret as long as possible, which made advanced zoning changes impracticable. I'm bad at reading. Josh Peck is not in Riverdale, is he? That one twin though, the Sweet Life of Zach and Cody, Cole Sprouse, isn't it? Because Dylan, the other one, he is not really acting anymore. He owns, I believe, a meadery in Brooklyn. Meadery, as in the honey alcohol. Okay, back to the West Side Improvement. These are not competition projects, but units in the living life of people that will affect the daily life of the thousands of individuals and families who live within the adjacent neighborhoods, Weinberg wrote. Before the West Side Improvement is built, its effect on those neighborhoods should receive greater study. Analyzing the rest of the West Side, that the Henry Hudson Parkway would run. Actually, the two young reformers found it would run through its center. And the location of a giant clover leaf planned in the center to provide an interconnection with another parkway Moses was proposing, the Mosholu, was near the only freshwater marsh of any size left in all of New York. When biology teachers had protested to one of Moses's aides about the destruction in part of the marsh, the last spot in the city at which students could study marsh plants, birds, and animals, the Moses man assured them that the destruction was an inexact term. Beautification was more suitable, for Commissioner Moses planned to landscape the marsh by dredging it to create a series of lagoons with formal shrubbery around their edges. Also, I bet that teacher who was really concerned about science was from the Bronx School of Math and Science, which is kind of well known, I think, because it's a public school, but it's a magnet school and it's really hard to get into. And its list of alumni is crazy. It's like, I don't know, so many great minds have come out of that school. And it's right next to this park. And the aide went on, they needn't worry that the job would only be half done. The commissioner was always thorough. The marsh was going to be landscaped not only near the cloverleaf, but also along its entire length. One of the teachers begged Exton to fight for one of the most beautiful spots with a riot of plant life and birds. I wondered how short-sighted officials could expect any planted shrubs would equal that dense thicket. The primeval wilderness of Inwood Hill Park was not the only priceless and irreplaceable natural asset that would be lost to the city and its people forever if Moses was allowed to carry out his plan, Exton realized. And as Exton and Weinberg proceeded with their study, they realized that there was yet another, vastly more important natural asset that was going to be lost to the city, its waterfront. It didn't require much brains to see that running the highway in Riverside Park along the water would have the effect of making sure the waterfront itself could never be used for a park, Weinberg recalled. It would forever eliminate, for recreational purposes, several miles of the most beautiful waterfront in the world. Except at scattered, difficult-to-reach locations, people would no longer be able to stroll beside the broad river, play beside it, fish in it, or picnic beside it. They would no longer be able even to look at it in peace. There would be a massive barrier of steel and concrete, and the road of the motors of countless cars between the watcher and the water. There should be a highway through Riverside Park, agreed, But why could the highway not run where every other planner wanted it to run, atop the New York Central tracks that ran either up the center of the park or close to the slopes leading up toward Riverside Drive? That would leave the rest of the park free for recreation, all the way down to the waterfront, as well as free from automobiles, and overpasses or underpasses could easily allow pedestrians to cross the highway to get to it. What lay between the I'm starting to get a little sick of this part. Is it just me? I don't know. What lay between the two young reformers and Moses was partly a question of values. Moses's had been formed in a different age, the age 20 years and more in the past, when he had been a young reformer. To understand his dream for the West Side Improvement, one had to understand the age in which he had dreamed it. In that age, parks had been for the upper and comfortable middle classes, and one of the things those classes wanted most to do in parks was to drive through them at the slow, leisurely speed of the era and enjoy their scenery. In that age, therefore, it made sense for a road through a park to be placed at its most scenic location, in the case of Riverside Park, at the river's edge. But things had changed. There had been 125,101 motor vehicles in New York City in 1914, and there were 804,620 in New York City in 1934. And additional hundreds of thousands in the Westchester and New Jersey suburbs that would also pour cars onto the Henry Hudson Parkway. Heavy traffic on Moses's Long Island parkways was already beginning to make driving on them less and less a source of pleasure and more a source of pain, or at least irritation. Their value as a source of beauty and pleasure in themselves was already clearly diminishing. At the same time, moreover, the need for providing and preserving other values was becoming more important. Cities were growing. Their people were being cut off more and more from nature. They needed every chance they could be given to see it and feel it around them. Recreation had been the keyword among park enthusiasts when Moses had started building parks. Now, conservation was being heard more and more. In a New York in which concrete was devouring green grass and trees more hungrily every year, nothing was more necessary of conservation than the last piece of natural woodland in Manhattan or a beautiful and unique swamp in Van Cortlandt Park and its waterfront. You won't believe it. There's another moreover. We've had so many moreovers on this page. Moreover, as Weinberg had pointed out, the highway was going to be inevitably a part of neighborhoods. The West Side Improvement could give adjoining neighborhoods a priceless bounty, a great waterfront on which they could, without expense or travel, walk around and recreate themselves and their families. And if the river were ever cleansed of pollution, and this possibility should be considered, no matter how remote, for a public improvement such as Moses was proposing might well last for centuries, and anything could happen in centuries, they could swim in it someday, swim almost at their very doorstep. Build a highway along that waterfront, erect huge viaducts of steel and pavements of concrete at the water's edge, and that waterfront would be gone, possibly forever, lost to the hungry city until the end of time. Build the West Side Improvement to Robert Moses' specifications, and the city would undoubtedly gain in many ways, but it would lose in many ways too, and it would lose in ways that could never be remedied. This part is a little, he's being so dramatic. Anyway, Moses might have seen these truths if he had been willing to listen to those who saw them so clearly, but he refused to listen, granting Exton only one interview, the one in which he was just sitting there laughing at you. Other city officials who listened to Exton and Weinberg didn't laugh. From the edge of the high bluff in Fort Tryon Park, on the north side of the cloisters, Comptroller McGoldrick could see Inwood Hill Park and the community of Spuyten Duyvil spread out below to the north as clearly as they had been part. The comptroller is seeing them as clearly as if they had been parts of a diorama. With his eyes following Exton's pointing finger, McGoldrick could see at a glance how much lay in the path of Moses's route. Thickly forested slopes in the park, quietly residential streets in the community, and how little in the path of Exton's. He could see how little harm would be done to the park if a narrow band was sliced off its eastern edge for part of the right-of-way, and how the city street alongside the park would provide most of the rest. I literally feel like he's filibustering right now. Oh, is it just me? Am I being insensitive? I can't. Oh, this is crazy. Sorry to Spuyten Duyvil, the 3 apartment buildings there. Sorry, guys. If I'm being insensitive, but across the river, beyond the northern terminus, for the low-level bridge Exton wanted, below the built-up slopes of Spuyten Duyvil to the left, there stretched dramatically, straight north, a valley occupied only by flimsy tar paper shacks. A valley which might have been placed there as an ideal parkway right-of-way. Their route would have added maybe 3/4 of a mile, McGoldrick recalled. But what's 3/4 of a mile to a motorist? We literally just talked about this. A flick of the eye, that's all, and it would have saved the park and Riverdale and Fieldston from having a trench run through it. Some officials found flaws in Moses's plan that Exton and Weinberg hadn't thought of. Moses's ingeniously restrictive laws and ingeniously low clearance parkway bridges had ensured that buses would never be able to ruin the beauty of his Long Island parkways or carry poor people along them to his state parks. That, by the way, is, I think, the best, repeatable fun fact when you're talking to random people and they're like, oh, what did Robert Moses do? You can be like, yeah, he built the bridges really low so that buses couldn't come to the parks because he didn't want anyone poor to go. Anyway, the last mention of the West Side Improvement is page 556. Actually, I was going to say thank God, but that's actually not good news because that's 20 pages from now. If we get some characters and stuff, if things start heating up, it'll be fun. If there's construction and if he pulls some stunts during construction or yeah, that stuff is fun to read about. I'm trying to stay strong. Dollar values are coming up. Good Lord. Okay. I think I might. What do you guys think about? So I know that he probably put in the exact dollar numbers. That was probably a choice to not round to the nearest million or whatever. But man, sometimes it's just very nice for me to just look and read 8 million instead of 8,177,463 or whatever. I don't know. So if I abbreviate, you'll have to forgive me. Okay, so let's see. The Board of Estimates chief engineer, Philip P. Farley, noticed that Moses was planning to low bridge the city too. That's cool as a verb. Enough of his Henry Hudson Parkway bridges were going to have a maximum headroom of 13 feet and a headroom at the curb of 11 feet, so that usage of the parkway by buses, which were exactly 13 feet high, would be impractical. 1/3 of the families in the city have automobiles, Farley reported to the board. The other 2/3 depend on buses. We've heard these numbers before also. If they are to get any benefit from this improvement, buses must use it. Moreover, while the principal function of Moses' Long Island parkways, had been to enable drivers to reach state parks, the principal function of the Henry Hudson Parkway would be to enable drivers from the Bronx and Westchester to commute to their jobs in Manhattan. His earlier roads had been roads for pleasure, but this would be a road for business. Without buses, commuting on it could only be by car. Obviously, dude. This might well prove impractical, but not only would the parkway increase the flow of cars into traffic-clogged Manhattan, but with the inevitable increase in the population of Spuyten Duyvil, Riverdale, and Westchester, car traffic might well overwhelm the parkway. In some future generation, opening it to buses, each able to carry 40 or more car drivers, might well become imperative. But as Farley said, the normal life of the parkway bridges is estimated at 100 years. Rebuilding them after the parkway itself had been completed would be enormously expensive. One of the 13-foot bridges, the one at 239th Street, was by design the centerpiece of a large traffic interchange, all of which would have had to be rebuilt at a cost of millions of dollars. If Moses was allowed to build low bridges, even if the city might in some future generation want to allow buses on the Henry Hudson Parkway, it might simply be financially impractical to do so. But Moses wouldn't listen to the city's officials. When McGoldrick tried to talk to him about the alternate route, he cut the comptroller short. He would brook no change, McGoldrick recalls. It had to be straight. When Farley recommended that the board disapprove the bridge designs, Moses called the recommendation absurd in the light of the law, the Parkway law that he had written, of course, and told the board flatly that if the bridges weren't built his way, they would not be built at all. The old reformers who headed the city's good government organizations were products of an earlier era, many of them of the same era as Moses, but they were willing to listen to the two young reformers, and listening, they were convinced. Once the board of the Municipal Art Society had a debate, Exton recalls, it took a view that Moses was ruining Inwood Hill. This is a crazy name for a person. Electus D. Litchfield, a great and good architect, said what a beautiful view there was from the road. I said that from the road there is a beautiful view, but to the road there's a lousy view. And I still remember I still remember some of the old-time architects and Beaux Arts boys who were on that board saying, "Hear, hear." Soon the Citizens Union, the City Club, and the Regional Plan Association were all asking for a detailed examination of Moses's proposal. Moses stopped laughing. He wrote a letter to the trustees of the City Club charging that the two men were pushing the alternate route because it would increase the value of Weinberg's Spuyten Duyvil real estate. Honestly, great point. There was no truth in what he said. None at all, Exton recalls. Remember that Exton is a womanizer and he can't keep a girlfriend. But there's a lot of women that are interested in him because he's so charming. I just feel like that really colors everything he does. I don't know if I trust Exton. And then, okay, quote from Exton. Bob did own some real estate in Spuyten Duyvil, but it was a small property he had inherited from his parents. Okay, sorry, Bob is indeed Exton, not Moses. He owned some real estate in Spuyten Duyvil, but it was a small property he'd inherited from his parents. Really, really insignificant. It's just from his parents. When compared to other property he had inherited. He was quite wealthy, you know? And the property was undeveloped and near the route Moses wanted. If the parkway was put along Moses' route, the property would have become quite valuable. Our route would have left it just as it was. Its value would have been increased by Moses' route, not ours. And Moses must have known that the alternate route wouldn't have done what he was saying it would, increase the value of Weinberg's property. It was obvious, but he said it anyway. His only reply to everything we had proposed was an ad hominem attack on us, and it was all a lie, a goddamned lie. City Club President Eustace Seligman called Exton in, questioned him about the charge, and then told the trustees that he was completely satisfied as to the young man's integrity. The City Club Park Committee therefore accompanied Exton to the high bluff at the cloisters and saw, as McGoldrick had seen, the advantages of the alternate route. And when Moses refused even to grant the committee an interview, it issued a report notable in that it was the first formal censure of Moses by any of the good government organizations that had long supported him, that called his plan a violation of the principles of good planning. While we are, for Mr. Moses as a man, having bent over backward in our efforts to get the order number 129 of Secretary Ix rescinded, his treatment here is high-handed and not in the best interest of the public, the report said. Wow, order number 129 was a blast from the past to another overly long chapter. That was the time when the PWA was like, you have to step down from one of your roles, otherwise we won't give you any money. And he was like, actually, I need to have both of my jobs. And he won. Other good government groups that investigated the West Side Improvement also agreed with Exton and Weinberg. The RPA, what is that? RPA? What's the RPA? It probably doesn't even matter. RPA, New York City. It was the Regional Plan Association. He shouldn't have abbreviated that. Considering that he never abbreviated FDR, like he purposefully, well, at least in the Power Broker podcast, the guy Elliot was saying that when he says Franklin Roosevelt, it really makes you like separate this guy from the, FDR acronym that carries all this, like, I don't know, lore and respect and aura. But yeah, he did. I can't believe he's abbreviating RPA. Anyway, but the reformers' front was far from solid. The logical group to lead a protest about park plans was the Park Association, and the president of the Park Association was Mrs. Sulzberger. And Jack Madigan was telling Mrs. Sulzberger that Inwood Hill was used only for necking. And in the middle of the fight, Mrs. Sulzberger sent Moses a letter which, while not specifically mentioning the West Side Improvement, said that the association had reviewed the many developments which are taking place in the park under your energetic leadership and decided that we ought to express to you officially our approval and delight in what you are doing. Even the City Club's board of directors ended up disowning its park committee's report, despite a statement by director Nathan Strauss, noting that every organization that has studied the project has agreed that the lower route is the only practical one. He accused Moses of treating city parks as if they were his own private property. Those reformers who still objected found that the powers they had been so instrumental in persuading LaGuardia and the legislature to give Moses were now turning against them. They appealed to the Board of Estimate to stop the Park Commission from chopping down the trees in Inwood Hill Park, but then remembered, with a shock, that under the Park Department Consolidation Act, which they had supported, in violation of their own stated principles, the board had no authority over the details of work within parks. Since Moses was not using city money for the work, moreover, he did not need board approval for any work in Inwood Hill. I'm kind of confused because before Mr. Exton and Seligman or whatever showed up, it seemed like he had to do it through the parks because that was how he got enough money. It had to be through the parks so that he could use WPA funds that were set aside for parks. And so he had to do it through the middle of the park. But I guess maybe he didn't have to do it through the middle of the park. He could have done it in the side of the park. But I don't really understand why Moses is doing this. Do you? So far, we have no motive yet. Then they demanded that Moses hold a public hearing on his plans and threatened to file a taxpayer's suit to obtain an injunction if he did not agree to hold one. Moses agreed. He set a date 2 weeks away, and then, during those 2 weeks, he cut down hundreds of trees for the right-of-way. He knew how to handle them, Madigan would laugh years later, recalling the reformers' shock when they realized that the park they had wanted so much to save had been ruined. Moses himself regarded his move as a masterstroke. He devoted space in his memoirs to relating how his men invented a new ingenious tree-pulling device equipped with a sort of electric donkey engine. I need a picture of it. That cut down trees even faster than he had hoped. Yeah, my boys really figured out that electric donkey engine for tree pulling. You wouldn't even believe how fast they pulled trees like donkeys up there. The Board of Estimate did have power over the Riverside Park section of the project because despite the federal and state contributions, the city would have to furnish much of the money itself. Borough President Samuel Levy of Manhattan proposed preserving the waterfront for pedestrians by building the Henry Hudson Parkway not along the water but over the New York Central tracks. Moses replied by driving stakes. Starting work in Riverside Park on the recreational facilities the public wanted, he asked the board if they wanted the work wasted. He whipsawed the board. He announced publicly that his plans were not only ready, but approved by the federal government, which was prepared to give the city millions of dollars for them. If the board accepted Levy's proposal, he said, new plans would have to be drawn up. That would take months. Then the plans might or might not gain federal approval. Even if they did, federal money might no longer be available. The city should not risk losing the chance of a century to get the job done. Wow, hello, happy early Memorial Day. I just biked around Brooklyn and now I'm a little sun-kissed. And now I'm back and we have been talking for a really long time about how he's building the Henry Hudson Parkway straight through the middle of some parks in the Bronx. And at first I didn't really care. And then he just like pulled this move where he just went rogue and cut down all the trees before getting approved. And now I'm like, oh, that was such an asshole move. I can't really get behind this one, Bobby. That's what's happening right now. Okay. He misinformed the board. He told it at one point that Levy's plan would cost $34 million, while his would cost only $6 million. His plan is the one straight through the middle of the park. Levy's is the one that's over the highway on top of the railroad tracks, a little double decker moment. He deluged the board with attractively printed brochures showing the beauty of his plan. He invoked experience and past successes. When Levy tried to argue for an impartial engineering survey of the two plans, Moses said, "The problem is primarily for park, parkway, and landscape experts, and not one of simple engineering." And he reminded the board that his men were park, parkway, and landscape experts who had built Jones Beach. Ever heard of it? Levy was certain that his plan would not cost $34 million, and he was certain that Moses's would cost way more than $6 million. But without enough technically proficient engineers to cost out Moses's plans, without press support, not only did the press accept Moses's figures as truth, it did not even discuss at length such issues as waterfront preservation. With LaGuardia against him, because the mayor wanted the West Side Improvement built before November 1937, when he would be running for re-election, and exerting pressure on the board members, the borough president was helpless. Hardly had he completed an acerbic exchange with Moses, Moses, "Do you think you know more about building parkways than I do?" Levy, "I didn't say so." Moses, "Well, this is a parkway." I don't really understand that exchange. I don't know if I would have called that acerbic. Maybe. You must have just had to be there. Had to have been there. Okay, the board approved Moses's plan. If there was any desire for second thoughts, there wasn't time for them. The very day after approval was given, huge pile drivers were hammering bulkheads into the Hudson River off the shore of Riverside Park. Within a week, convoys of dump trucks, 500 a day. Where do you even find 500 dump trucks to do this? How many dump trucks do you think there are in the New York City area? This is probably, tens of thousands. How do you just get 500 suddenly? The convoys of dump trucks were rumbling over the dirt roads leading into the park. 6,000 WPA paid laborers were shoveling into place the rock and earth the trucks were delivering, and pouring over them cement that would harden into a new shoreline for Manhattan Island. Progress on the Henry Hudson Bridge was just as rapid. By the time the board got around to considering whether the Bronx route should go through Spuyten, Duyvil, its approval was required for that because its money was required for the condemnation necessary there. So by that time, the northern bridgeheads were fixed in place in Spuyten, Duyvil. There was no choice but to approve the Spuyten, Duyvil route, and Moses did not let the pace slacken. The speed with which the West Side Improvement was driven to completion was symbolized by the construction of the bridge that carried the Henry Hudson Parkway over Broadway at 253rd Street in Riverdale, a job that would normally have taken at least a year to complete. The legislation. Wait, so it should have taken a year, but we don't know how long it actually took. Maybe we're about to get into that. The legislation authorizing construction of the bridge by the State Council of Parks was signed at 1 p.m. May 1st, 1935. At 5 p.m. the same day, Moses opened bids on the job and let the contract. At 7 a.m. the next morning, laborers were working on the site. One midnight a few weeks later, while most Riverdalians were asleep, the 6 7-foot-wide steel spans that would hold the roadbed of the bridge rumbled up Broadway on huge flat floats pulled by tractors, and at 5:55 a.m., the last rivet securing them in place over Broadway was set. When Riverdalians, best exonym of a New York City neighborhood we've gotten in this book so far, I think I'm going to say that confidently. When Riverdalians went to work in the morning, there before them was a bridge where none had existed the night before. Moses's reluctance to I can't stop reading this. It's actually kind of good. It picked up. Moses' reluctance to discuss his plans for the northern section of the West Side Improvement was understandable. He could not, after all, tell Exton and Weinberg the real reason he had wanted the approach to the Henry Hudson Bridge to be through Inwood Hill Park instead of along the street at its edge. Finally, we have a motive. I think this might be the one where, oh, shoot, what's that guy's name? The guy that founded the New York, or he didn't found the New Yorker, he founded, like, Harper's or something? That one media guy, the Hearst, the William Randolph Hearst. I wonder if it's the Hearst bribe that we got a little mention of it a long time ago. I can't remember if that's this one. We'll see. Okay, so it's a big secret motive. If word ever leaked that a 6-lane highway was being classified as a park access road, the CWA and WPA would have to reclassify the project. Oh, okay, never mind. Sorry, that was a false. That must have happened at a different time. Moses could not explain to Exton and Weinberg that while it might be better to build the bridge on a lower level near the existing drawbridge and therefore avoid Inwood Hill Park and Spuyten Duyvil, his idea of the proper location didn't matter. Only the bankers' ideas mattered because it was the bankers who had to put the money up for the bridge. Moses could not, in fact, allow any discussion of the bridge location at all because discussion generates controversy, and controversy frightens away the timid, and no one is more timid than a banker where his money is concerned. Okay, so the whole thing really was about the park access road little loophole, which is how he's getting money for it. So it all makes sense. Quote, the market was so skittish that any little thing could have gotten them to back out, Jack Madigan recalls. A lesser fellow wouldn't have understood the importance of killing off this agitation right at the start before it began raising up some publicity and getting people arguing. But Moses understood it perfectly. That was a quote from Jack Madigan. The financing of the northern section of the West Side Improvement had been made possible only by remarkable ingenuity on Moses's part, an ingenuity that bent rules and regulations, twisted them, in fact, until they were all but unrecognizable, into a shape that permitted the participation in the financing of the project of bankers and 22 separate city, state, and federal agencies. Exposure of that ingenuity to the public would tumble in an instant the house of cards he had so laboriously erected. He could not allow it. And what good would discussion do anyway? The city had been trying to build the West Side Improvement for decades, generations. It had never, even in the free-spending Walkerian era, oh my goodness, that was a fun throwback. Do you guys remember the Walkerian era? Jimmy Walker took meetings exclusively in the Central Park Casino. A huge Tammany guy, bought a bunch of furs for his many mistresses, was always just wanted to be a singer, had a hit song. His dad made him go to law school. He sucked at law school. Then he became the mayor. Then he was in so much legal trouble from the Seabury investigation that he had to go to Europe with all of his, I'm saying multiple because I remember there being multiple, but it might have just been one actress mistress. So I think he went to Paris for a while. And then he came back and then pursued music, which is what his dream always was. Do you remember that? If that might have been review if you've been around for a while, but I do remember the Walkerian era. I'll be done soon. I've been going off on too many tangents. So the city had never been able to find the funds to do the job. It could only be done now because of the federal relief program, and that program might be curtailed at any time. If the job was ever to be done, it had to be done at once without delay. Discussion meant delay, and therefore discussion could not be permitted. There was no alternative. See, no alternative, Madigan says. Madigan's statement was not accurate. There was an alternative. It just was not an alternative that he or Robert Moses would ever consider. There might be no alternative if the bridge had to be built immediately. But why did it have to be built immediately? If the bankers refused to finance its construction unless it was located on the escarpment, a location which required the destruction of Inwood Hill Park and Spuyten Duyvil, why was it necessary to accept their terms? The city could simply refuse them and wait until it could build the bridge itself in the place where it should be built. Okay, I think I'm going to read one more paragraph. And it might not have to wait too long. The situation now was significantly different from the past. Construction of the approach roads was, thanks to Moses, well underway at last. To the south, from the Battery to 193rd Street, just a mile from the Harlem River. To the north, all the way down through Westchester and into the city down to 249th Street, a point only about a mile from the river. More than 16 miles of the through route was under construction. Only 2 miles, including the bridge, remained to be built. There was no longer a project not begun. It was a project largely completed. This was no longer a project not begun. With LaGuardia and City Hall, the city's government had the will to complete it. With more than 90% of the cost already paid, moreover, this was no longer a project whose cost was $109 million. It was a project whose cost, the cost of its uncompleted 2 miles, including bridge, was less than $10 million. The city might not have $10 million to spare at the moment, but it was not unrealistic to suspect that, with LaGuardia running city finances with an iron hand, it might have it someday. Someday soon, as in fact was going to be the case. By 1936, the city had sufficient leeway in its capital budget to build the bridge itself. Okay, I think that, okay, this is going to be done in one paragraph, so I'm reading one more paragraph, and then then it looks like there's going to be a vibe shift. Such an alternative might well have appealed to Exton and Weinberg. There was an immediate need for the bridge, of course, and there was a risk in delaying its construction. The risk that the city's financial position might worsen, or its will to do the job might fade, and the bridge would never be built. But such risks had to be weighed against the certainties entailed in the construction of the bridge at the point the bankers wanted. The destruction of Manhattan's priceless last forests and of Riverdale's priceless serenity. Weighing the risks, Exton and Weinberg might well have decided on delay. The city, represented by its elected officials, might have so decided too. But such considerations did not weigh more than a feather on Robert Moses's private scales, unbalanced as they were by his desire for accomplishment, for achievement, for the tangible, physical realization of his dreams. For such dreams, as the man who echoed his thoughts, Jack Madigan, put it, money is all. Now at last, after 2 decades of dreaming of the West Side Improvement, he had the money for it, and he was not about to let that money slip away. Yeah, I remember that, Jack Madigan would say 30 years later when asked about the Exton-Weinberg proposal, and the hard, quiet voice would be filled with contempt and disgust. I remember that as an asinine idea, brother. Robert Moses did not give the city a chance to decide. Okay, whew, I'm calling it. The next sentence, that's all I'm reading, is the Henry Hudson Bridge opened on December 12, 1936. So that's what's coming up. Thanks for coming. This is kind of fun. I've been really inconsistent about this, but it's always fun when I do it. So thank you for coming. Sorry for when I make really dumb comments mid reading, like when I don't understand what's happening and then I like have an idea of what's happening, which I say aloud and then it's wrong. I think that as a reader that would probably be a little annoying. So sorry. See you later. How's post thesis life, Jake? I'm like so invested now. You studied urban studies, I think, or something like that. Did you learn the same thing that Exton and Weinberg learned, which was that it should be human-minded? Oh, math and stats. That was really dumb of me. Sorry. I should take notes. I'm gonna remember. I'm gonna write a little note. And I need to write down where people live because I always forget that too. I know that Farzan lives in Pennsylvania, right? But I don't know what part of Pennsylvania. Or maybe New Jersey? See, look, my memory's gone. How's the math and stats going? Do you like making graphs? I think I need to do some I'm writing a book about Wikipedia and I am trying to get more graphs in there, and I don't know. I took like a bunch of computer science classes in college, but I did not quite enough to get the minor. But I feel like with what I know and like Stack Overflow and occasionally ChatGPT, I can, usually, get some good graphs. But lately, I've been having some issues, so I might okay, it's like these graphs are, just, crunching numbers. It's like Python and SQL random stuff, but also it's, getting a bunch of stuff getting a bunch of data from Wikipedia sometimes is annoying. I'm not always good at figuring out the Wikipedia APIs because a lot of them were made by random volunteers, and, there's, some that were made by volunteers, and you can't always tell, which ones work for what, and then they always fall apart because some of them are maintained by volunteers. So that the APIs have been giving me trouble. Me, I'm probably a matplotlib. That's the one that I think I could produce the code myself without checking the best. And then I've done some ggplotting, and I don't really do so much Excel. I just think the Excel graphs are kind of ugly. Wait, Farzan, what's your thesis? I'm gonna write this in my notes. R? Okay, I never really got good at R. What type of what type of thesis are you doing? Did you know that I studied that? Yeah, I personally have done more Python than R, but the only reason I would choose Python is just because it's the only one that I've actually used. Yeah, I did. I studied neuroscience. I don't really remember very much of it though, even though it was only 3 years ago. Sometimes at trivia, there are questions about things that I really should know. I might have mentioned this on here. I can't remember. I mentioned this to someone. One time at trivia, one of the questions was the answer was ribosome. It was just parts of the cell, and I got it wrong. I think it was partially because I was overthinking it, but also I just think that I don't even remember the organelle. So serotonin in olfaction in flies. That's great. Are you doing changing their genes, and then how are you measuring the serotonin? Are you making it glow green or something? I one time had a class where we had to do that, and you had to dissect the flies to get their brains out. And what you had to do was pinch with these really bizarre tweezers that the teacher would tell us. She would tell us every 2 seconds, and remember these tweezers, they cost $200. So you would have to take these tweezers, and then you have to pull right in this part of the poor Drosophila, and that way its head would slip off, and you would just get a clean brain. But I was really bad at it, super bad. I was one of the ones that always was staying kind of late. Usually everyone left early because they got their brains, but I had to stay kind of late and just hang out with the teacher. There are many things in the world I'm bad at, remembering where you live and your majors, and also extracting the brains from flies. Okay, RFP, GFP, and RNAi on the receptors. Okay, great. That I will be wait, is it an undergrad or master's or PhD or what? Or something, or a secret fourth option? Associates. Nice. Are you trying to become a scientist? There was a girl in my wow, now I'm really, on memory lane, but there was a girl in my that one fly dissection class who was always so good, and sure enough, she's probably 2 years into her PhD now, and she is studying fly brains. So no wonder she was so good at it. Also, what's near Pittsburgh? Is that Carnegie Mellon that's over there? I can't even remember what's over there. The University of Pittsburgh? Carnegie Mellon? It's not really that close to College Station. What lab is my friend in by chance? It's a really small world. I would have to really look it up. Apparently bees have different She goes to UT Austin, and I could look it up, and if you come back, I'll, like, check and remember for you. Wait, Luke, where do you live? I need to have my, my notes, update my notes so that way I never forget your locations. Hudson, New York. Oh, that's there's a lot of stuff that's happening up there, and my mental map is not great. So sorry that I didn't know. Okay, I am gonna go. See you later.